This is the Cedar Creek Church Living It Out podcast, a midweek reminder where we discuss key takeaways and principles from the weekend message to help you live out the truth that you matter.
Well, hey, everybody, welcome to the Living It Out podcast. Thanks so much for listening. My name is Casey. I'm your host today, and I'm joined with Marna Ward. Marna, how are you doing today?
Good, Casey. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so pumped to be here. Thanks again so much for listening. Again, this is a Living It Out podcast. If you maybe stumbled upon and found your way here searching through things on our app, step one, go back and listen to the weekend message. This conversation is really just some intentional conversation around the weekend message, and hopefully to give you some really clear next steps, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, on your adventure, if you will, and hopefully to give you some clarity as to what those next steps could look like. But before we jump to that, we like to just talk about what's happening in the world, and what's most important right now is the weather, because it's the weirdest time in the world, or the weirdest time of the year to live and where we live in the world. Northwest Ohio, it's just super weird weather in like April, and so it's supposed to snow this week. I feel like I was like skeptical about it at first. Now I've seen it on the Weather Channel app, so it's real. That it's supposed to come, but I'm also hopeful that this 50 or 60 degree weather the next day will just negate it, and it won't really matter.
So it all depends on where you look right now. Like, this is the whole game that you play. You're like, okay, on my weather app, it shows rain. Weather Channel is saying snow. I mean, like, it all depends on the temperature. Like, who are we going to go with here?
That's hilarious. That's so funny. So that's what's the most important in the world right now, is the fact that it's going to snow in the middle of April. I guess we're over the hump of middle, towards the back half, like
the second half.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's so crazy. Anyways, we are in a series right now called The Adventure of You. And last weekend, Ben asked the question. This is the first weekend of the series. He asked the question, what was the last adventure that you went on? And then this weekend, continue that conversation as he talked a little bit through the movie that you should definitely go watch it. Great adventure movie. And Marna, I'll ask you. Let's ask that first. What is your favorite adventure movie? Because I think that's a good kind of segue into adventures.
Does Mission Impossible count for this? Like, I don't know if there's a genre that I'm now way outside of, but like, I love the Mission Impossible movies. There's just something,
that counts.
Right? Like, there's a problem, like it has all the components. I was trying to think through it. Like, let's see, was there an uncovering? Did he have to clarify, some of that kind of stuff? So I think so. I'm standing by it. Mission Impossible. So
I love it. The Goonies is actually one of my favorites, but this is my first movie ever in a theater. I was 5 years old. This isn't my favorite adventure movie, but when I think of adventure movies, this is where my mind goes, because it was like the first time when I felt like I was engrossed in an adventure that wasn't mine, and I got to just watch all the pieces of it. This is so dumb. It was Barney and the Lost Egg, and there was this adventure that Barney and his friends went on. They were in hot air balloons. They went on a submarine. They did a whole bunch of things, and I just remember being a little kid and having that feeling of like, oh, I need that in my life. Like, I longed for adventure watching Barney and
Barney
the Lost
on the
Egg.
big screen, man. On the big screen.
So anyways, with that whole idea of adventure, we were talking about what does it look like to actually go on an adventure. Ben clarified last week the difference between a trip and an adventure, and I'm saying all of this because I like to share what's happening in my life. It's fun for me. I just get excited about everything. But my wife and I are planning a trip to Utah here shortly. Where we're gonna be hitting all 5 the national parks, and it is going to be the epitome of an adventure. We have some of it planned out. We have 2 nights in a place where we're gonna stay. We have the rest of the nights probably in our car.
Wow.
So it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really excited about it, and that is my next adventure, and I cannot wait to go on it, because I know that there's going to be so many problems to solve. We'll probably get in an argument or two, my wife and I, and we'll be better on that back end of it than we are on the front end.
It's like in a mini Amazing Race sort of thing. Like, now, if only you had a large clock ticking over you with sort of thing. So.
In some ways we do. We got to make it to Salt Lake by the end of the week, so we'll make it. Yeah, that's amazing.
That's amazing. I love it.
Marna, I know you mentioned earlier too, your family's been thinking about and dreaming about what adventures could look like for you guys this summer. I don't even have to share too many details, but what's going on in the Ward family as far as adventures go?
So if you've listened to this podcast at all, as you know, my husband is definitely the adventurer, one of the two of us. And I was sharing with you, he's been like a bird with his wings clipped during all of COVID. And so he's literally penciling in like school ends, and then I like Iceland. He wants to see the volcanoes. Like he's got all of these big
I love it.
plans. So, and his face just absolutely lights up at the very thought of it. And so I know that he's gonna have to go at least a couple places. And I'm always like, have fun. And so about as venturous as I'm going to get is we are planning another trip down to Gulf Shores. This was a place that we went to several years in a row when the kids were little. And so we're returning to that place this summer. At least that's the plan.
Sweet.
So, yeah.
Nice. That's awesome. That's awesome. I'll say another adventure we have going on this summer is our student camps, and that is for sure always an adventure. We plan so much and organize so many things, but it always
Yeah.
turns out to be an adventure full of unexpected and crazy things that are so fun. So, yeah,
I
this is
love
going to
it.
be. I'm excited. I love this series. I love adventuring. I just felt like it was fun to talk about that. So for those of you
Yeah.
listening, I don't know what that looks like for you. I would encourage you to engage. That's a great conversation to be having with your friends in general. Like, what's your next adventure?
Hmm.
uh, uh, Brian Bacher, you've had Ben on here before. His brother Brian always used to tell me you have to have something you're looking forward to. So I
Yeah.
just love that conversation. I think it's super fun.
Well, that's
But
great.
in the context of an adventure this weekend, we continued our series, the adventure of you, because life is an adventure, spirituality
Hmm.
is an adventure, faith is an adventure, and we talked about that this weekend by looking at the story of Rahab. And the
Hmm.
story comes from the book of Joshua. It's actually, this is one of I love the story. I think it's
Yeah.
one of the coolest pictures of the character of God in so many ways in the Old Testament. So Ben walked through and gave so much great context to that this weekend. But I would love to hear, Marna, maybe just like a 1,000-foot view of kind of the
Yeah.
story of Rahab, just to kind of catch us up real quick. I know it was this weekend, but maybe it's midweek. We're listening, maybe
Yeah.
forgot. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, it's so, I mean, it is kind of funny. Even I'm like, okay, now what was I have to stop and think about, just to make sure that it's like, oh, that's right. And I know for me, Rahab is the same way. It's such a compelling story. And remember, Moses has brought uh, this now people group. I mean, God has really adopted them as his own family, and Moses is leading them, and they've been through a lot up to this point. They're really at the end of what will soon be a fulfilled promise that God gave generations before them, that they would enter this promised land. And but the challenges are still coming, and this is one of them. Where they really have to meet this challenge of Jericho and find out what that looks like and is going to be for them, because they don't know. So here's some of the things that I always think about when we set these stories up, is that we have the whole story. For those of us who have heard the stories, a lot of times it's like, oh yeah, 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 yeah. And if you are not one of those people, that's okay too. We just have to remember that we see it from a different perspective than they did. And so when you think about Moses bringing this people group to Jericho, that is a fortified city and known to be the most well fortified city across any locations that they would be familiar with.
right.
And I think Ben kind of gave those visuals of what that wall around Jericho would have looked like. And so, because they don't know, and they don't know the end of the story, they don't know how God's going to move or how this is going to turn out, they send a couple of spies in to see how this is going to go. And Rahab is really so pivotal towards those spies being able to. I mean, they find safe harbor with her. They're protected by her. And in many ways, because of her role in them finding out the information that they needed to about Jericho, they were able to fulfill what ultimately was that promise that God was like, hey, you're going to march around these walls.
Hmm.
Because they're thinking, we're going to attack, right? And in fact, it ends up being a very different way that God does it. And
Yeah,
so,
that's great.
yeah, so Rahab plays that pivotal role in being a person inside Jericho that gives those two Israeli spies kind of the inside scoop. But she's
Yeah.
unlikely in so many ways.
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of where the whole story kind of is like, oh, okay, cool. Like even again, right? We know the whole scope. We know all the things happening, but I think when you can maybe just step out of that for a second. I love the way
Yeah.
you said that, Marna. I think that's super helpful. So Rahab's unique because of where she is, where the Israeli spies find her.
Yes.
she's a prostitute, right? And
She's a
that's what
prostitute.
makes this
Yep.
whole story so kind of like, huh? Like what do you mean? Like why use a prostitute? Like why use this person who has seemingly faulty character, who
Yes.
seemingly is making poor choices all the time, right?
Yeah.
And again, what a beautiful picture of God's character in this
Mm-hmm.
story. I think there was a word that Ben used this weekend, and I'll kind of get into it, but unlikely people. God uses unlikely people. Like even as I
Yes.
say that, and you told the whole context of the Israeli perspective, and then you have
Yeah.
Rahab's perspective, where she's in this city where her job is to sleep with men, visitors, foreigners. Like that's what she's paid to do, and that's yeah, obviously, knowing all that we know about sex and knowing all that we know about what that
Yeah.
implies, like that's not a profession that she probably was proud of. It probably wasn't something that she
Right.
had expected to be used by God, even living in that way. And I think that's
Right.
that's really important to be like, yeah, like God uses unlikely people, and in everybody's own way, we're unlikely.
Well, that's
There's
exactly right. Like, and I love how she would have had technically no reason to really know God in terms of
mm,
like they had started to hear the stories of what God had done for his people, including parting the Red Sea. And I mean, these miraculous
mm,
um, ways that God helped his people to move from Egypt through these lands. So all these stories had been filtering into Jericho, and I love that idea that she really was introduced to God and had a concept of him in part because of his work, because that's always at play. But that she was really, to your point, not in a position, she was not Jewish. She was not somebody who would have just like, oh, this is just a story. I mean, she's really entering at a point where it's like, boy, I've heard a lot about this. And I hope that you guys are who you say that you are, and I hope that who I've heard God is true. And I mean, she just puts everything on the line.
mm,
uh and to your point, Casey, from an unlikely spot in many ways, in a societal place that would not have built her for that. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to trust people. Like, no, her whole life would have pointed into a different direction. And yet there's a part of Rahab in all of us that
mm,
we don't want to lose in the midst of it either, is that
mm.
certainly she's somebody we can look to, but there are elements of those questions, those uncertainties, no matter what our life circumstances, that we're I have to believe we've all asked ourselves those same things too. Yeah.
Yeah, right, right. I
Right.
think the way you said that is so true. There is a part of Rahab in each of us. It may not be so
Mhm.
extreme, but
Right.
there's a part of us that is living some sort of way or making some sort of cognitive choice every day
Yep.
that we know we don't want to be in that position, yet God still uses those things and
Yep.
uses us being so
Mhm.
broken and so messed up to still impact, more people than we'll even ever know.
Yeah.
I think that's the cool part about it too.
Well, and that was that
So go ahead.
she was paying attention to what God was doing around her. So I think that was like, as you think about her and sort of where we're headed, it's like, okay, so she had made all these choices, but she was paying really close attention to again, these stories had been filtering back.
Hmm,
She had must have been processing some of that and thinking, okay, well, I is,
hmm,
are these stories true? And I think even again, she had some really hard choices to make when
hmm,
she's faced with these two spies about what is she going to do at this point? And had she not made the choice
hmm,
that she had, it's always kind of fun to think like, what would God would have worked his will always,
hmm.
but it would have, may have potentially looked very different. So
I
yeah.
think today we might, last point on this too, is we might want to read that story to say, like, she read the stories about God, she stopped being a prostitute, and then she helped the spies. It's like, no,
That's
behavior
great, Casey.
modification doesn't come with knowing God. Like that's not always like that's
Yeah.
knowing God is sitting in grace, experiencing that kindness and that I don't deserve this. Like I have nothing to
Mhm.
be made valuable, but the fact that God gives me that intrinsic value, like that's knowing God, right? Like that's
Yeah.
understanding. Right? As you read the Bible, you learn those truths about who He is. And behavior modification isn't bad, but I think this story just highlights the fact that God's going to use us regardless or not if we're always
Right
able to
where we
make
are.
the other choice, right? Like there might be some choices
Yeah.
we don't make, and then it's like, no, I'm going to use you now, and you're going to see that this choice is clear.
Well, and the beautiful part of it too is that because those spies make a promise to her that they ultimately fulfill,
Hmm.
she does have a whole new start and a whole, I mean, God completely changes her story and in many ways redeems it as he always does. But it is it's pretty, it's just so breathtaking. Even this weekend, we were only able to focus on a couple of those spots. But boy, if you have
Hmm.
a chance to go back and read Joshua,
Hmm.
and the other spots where Rahab is mentioned, because she's mentioned in the New Testament. That's where Ben started, right, in Hebrews, saying here she is in this hall of fame of faith people, because of the choice that she made. And
Yeah.
that's really that bottom line. Like we all have a choice to make. It leads to one challenge or another. And
Yeah.
that's that choose your heart, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that question. Like he said, choose your heart. Like what difficulty do you want? Like
Mm,
one way or another, your choices are going to lead to some sort of difficulty. It's just that one of them leads to life and leads to
yes.
life in the fullest, as Jesus said, which again, that bottom line, the choices you make today create the challenges you face tomorrow. And I know I
Yeah.
even joked earlier about my wife and I going to Utah and taking that trip and how we'll probably get into a fight, which we probably will. But I say that knowing that even like this, we just took a small trip this past week and there was some conflict within it. But we choose each other every day and we choose that we're going to fight even because we're trying to work through it. We're not fighting because we want to be in
Right.
separate camps at the end of the day. Like we're working through it because we know on the other end of it, the challenge we're going to face is going to help us experience relationship, help us experience grace, kindness, love, all those things that God wants us to experience with each other
Mm.
through that. So I think that bottom line is reinforced in our relationships as well. All that to
Yeah.
say,
Well,
yeah,
because
for
like you
sure.
said, Casey, you guys could choose to ignore it, avoid it, not do it, let it fester, get resentful. I mean, there's all sorts of choices.
Sure.
All of those are difficult. It's just as difficult. And thankfully, like you said, one leads to life and one to death. Like it's just as
Yeah.
difficult to go, hey, I'm going to step in here. Something's not right.
Hmm.
What's going on, sort of thing. And so I do love the, because gosh, it just is such a reminder of how we do. And this was, I mean, this was some of the killer stuff that we talked about last week, but it's like, man, we just want to be comfortable and it can be easier to be complacent. And, I mean, all of these elements are still following us this week where it's like, ah, well, we have to really stop and go, no, 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 wait, wait, wait.
Mm-hmm.
And really catch ourselves in those moments to go, what is going to be life giving? What is the choice that I need to be able to make here? Because either way, life is going to be hard. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
wow.
because life is challenging, life is difficult, and I loved Greg hearing his story this weekend. Really cool. It's kind of funny for me. If you again go back listen, Greg's message or
Yeah.
story is in the message. Well, I was in eighth grade when Greg started serving, and it's cool to see him be. And I was at West. I grew up in West Toledo, so like that
Okay.
was part of my story. And so
Yeah.
I saw Greg on stage all the time, and for him this weekend to see him share a little bit of his story and how he's struggled with the choice that he's made, yet God has still used him throughout that, and the grace that God showed him, the grace that he
Hmm.
experienced through the church, the kindness that he just continued to experience of us, the church, of God, of his friends, of his group, of Nate, meeting him where he is and saying, God's still
Yeah.
going to use you. We're going to work through this. Let me help you make a choice. And then at the end of the day, for Greg to be like, it was a choice that I felt like, for me, what I see in Greg's situation is I see him so overwhelmed by grace that he couldn't help but choose something different. And I think
Yeah.
ultimately that's what actually experiencing God is like. I know he used some of the language like God just took it from me. I can't. He couldn't explain it, and I think
Yeah.
that's grace. It's like this
Yeah.
this inability to explain why I am the way I am, why I'm given what I'm given that I don't deserve. And I loved
Yeah.
Greg's story. I love the way that he put that. I thought that was so uh,
Absolutely.
super cool to see tie in.
Well, and there's like a million ways that we define grace, but at its core, it's unmerited favor, right? Like we've
Mm,
done nothing to deserve it. And his story was so powerful. And I just was thinking too that I'm just really glad to be a part of a church where we can bring our challenges and we go, hey, uh, things are not well here. I'm not okay here. I'm really struggling here because one of the things we are so passionate about is being, a really safe place. And that doesn't always happen overnight. I think Greg's story was a great example of where he got connected, he was serving, he was part of a team, and had built trust with people to be able to go, hey, I'm not okay. And so I really and maybe this is just in some of the spaces where I am, and people that I'm interacting with, like, I'm not sure that there is any more important work than to allow God's spirit to work in that space and to go, hey, even though this is what's happening, even though this is a challenge, to be able to even look over those steps of Rahab's story and to be able to be the person sometimes that's delivering it in terms of like, hey, God has a purpose and plan for our lives. Like, let's see what God is up to. Like, he's calling attention to this for a reason, right? And so
Yeah.
helping people to make that hard decision and really encouraging them with hope that God has a future for you, that it doesn't end here, that, some of those components that I need to hear as much as offer it to other people around me, that feels like such a life-giving place to be. And I'm just really proud that we, and I'm not saying we always get it right, but man, it's such a privilege when we do, and when we don't, I hope we're given the opportunity to make that right.
Yeah.
So it's crazy good.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think even where we don't get it right as a church, like, and again, like, this doesn't mean that we're justified in that, but like, we're all
Mhm.
humans, and like, that's the kind of beauty of it all, is like, sometimes we aren't always great at showing grace, because we have pride, we have selfishness, we see only our
Yeah,
perspective. And my hope would be
yeah,
is that as a church collectively, as a group of people, is that even where maybe we don't receive the grace that we want, we can have enough grace back, and it's got to start somewhere, right? Like, grace has to begin with one person. And so
yeah,
and like just like Greg's story, once you start to receive that, it's hard to not let it kind of roll in some ways. I know that's a kind of a weird
yeah.
metaphor, but my wife and I always call it like the cycle of selflessness. Like, as one of
Hmm.
us dies to ourselves in some way, it makes it so much easier for the other person to do that. And it's weird how it works, and it just gets you in a really good rhythm and flow of being like, no, you got it,
Yeah,
you first, I got you.
yeah.
So
That's
all that to say,
awesome.
I would encourage anybody listening right now. I don't know what choice you need to make. Maybe you feel like your life is in an extreme spot, like Rahab, and there's some choices
Hmm.
that maybe a phone call you need to make, or whatever that looks like. I'd encourage you to do it. Um, there has been rare circumstances that I've gotten a text message from somebody sharing what's going on in their life that I've been like, oh my gosh, how dare they tell me? It's most of the time it's like, wow, I feel super honored that they would share that with me. And so
Yeah.
I don't know who that is, but I'm sure you do. And so I'd encourage you to reach out. And for those of you maybe
Mhm.
receiving that on the other end, I know Ben mentioned that this weekend, but handle those with grace, with so much grace and so much love, because
Yeah.
ultimately, the other person on the other side probably desires some behavior modification too, but they're not going to get that unless they experience grace first. And so
Yeah.
let's be people that lead with that. And I think we'll see God continue to see God work in some ways that we probably would have never expected, just like in the story that Ben
Yeah.
unpacked this weekend. We got to talk a little bit
Yeah.
about right now. Marna,
Yeah.
we've got right now we're in the midst of sharing stories. I'm sorry, do you have any other thoughts on that? I was kind of wrapping us up.
No, I was just going to say, if you are listening to this, or someone who's listening to this that maybe isn't sure how to make that phone call, or sometimes we can get ourselves in a tough spot. And that's why Celebrate Recovery is such an incredible place. So every Friday night, you can walk through the doors at 7 o'clock, which I have the privilege of working with some of the Celebrate Recovery leaders. And that first step is one of the hardest ones. And the people that are serving there, the people who attend Celebrate Recovery, they understand that. They understand that just walking through the door, that you just made a really hard choice right there. But
Yeah,
you are going to be greeted and welcomed, and invited in, and no pressure, sort of situation. And so every campus, every Friday night at 7 o'clock, again, for you, or maybe there's someone that you love that needs that invitation to CR. I just, it's such a powerful place where we see God really doing a lot of work. And so know that's an open door as well.
for sure, for sure. Well, thanks, Marna. As you've been listening to this series, you've heard us talk about sharing your story. We think it's super, super important for those of us that have experienced grace and are living in it, or in the midst of trying to figure it all out. being vulnerable and sharing and putting yourself out there is a key part of that, and we'd love to help be a part of that. So if you go to cedarcreek.tv/adventure, you can share your story right then and there, and also be following along with us on social. I know our team's been doing a really good job of trying to capture stories, sharing stories, giving you incentives to share your story. I think someone got a Cedar Point pass, like skydiving. There was a bunch of stuff going on I saw on social media. I don't know all the details. I'm just admittedly not on it as much as I probably could be, but there's some cool stuff happening. So follow along, share your story. We'd love to be a part of that and hear what God is doing in your life and in your adventure. And join us next week as we continue this conversation, the adventure of you. It's been super fun. I'm looking forward to next week's conversation. I'll be on my trip next week, actually, so I won't be here. You'll get somebody else.
All right.
It's like my only podcast of April because my April is so busy. But I'm glad to be here and glad to be hanging out. So Marna, Ben, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, everybody have a great rest of your
Enjoy
day.
your trip.
Oh, thank you so much, Marna. I appreciate that. Everybody else have a great rest of your day, and I hope you were reminded that you matter. Thanks so much.